6.5 years, and with no phone calls, no visits. They say his mama said she ain't seen them since like since they been in.
New footage of YNW Melly in jail goes viral after nearly 2,500 days behind bars without a conviction. New footage has surfaced showing YNW Melly inside Broward County Jail. But what's happening in that footage and why it's going viral right now is about to change everything you thought you knew about this case. The case that refuses to die. Let me take you back to the early morning hours of October 26, 2018. Picture this scene in your mind. A gray Jeep Compass tears through the darkened streets of South Florida, carrying 4 members of the YNW Collective, a tight-knit group of young rappers from the small, economically challenged town of Ford, Florida, who were chasing that SoundCloud dream together, building something from absolutely nothing. Inside that vehicle were Jamal Maurice Demons, better known to the world as YNW Melly, his close associate Cortland Henry, who goes by YNW Bortland, and 2 of their childhood friends, Anthony Williams, known as YNW Sackchaser, and Christopher Thomas Jr., known as YNW Juvie. These 4 young men had grown up together, struggled together, and were finally starting to taste success together. By the time the sun rose over the Florida horizon, 2 of those young men would be dead, their bodies riddled with bullets, their dreams extinguished forever. Now, according to the prosecution's theory of what transpired that fateful night, what happened next was nothing short of calculated, cold-blooded betrayal of the most devastating kind imaginable. They alleged that Melly, sitting in the rear driver's side seat of that Jeep, opened fire on his own friends, his brothers from the same small Florida town who had built this music collective together from nothing but shared talent and shared dreams.
October 26th of 2018, this defendant shot and killed 2 of his friends. He killed Christopher Thomas and Anthony Williams.
But here's where the story takes its most disturbing and twisted turn. According to prosecutors, after allegedly committing these brutal murders, Melly and Bortland didn't call 911 immediately. They didn't rush to get help for their wounded friends. They didn't panic or cry out in horror. Instead, they allegedly staged the entire gruesome scene to look like a random drive-by shooting. The prosecution claims they drove the bullet-riddled vehicle to a desolate, isolated area near the Everglades. A dead-end road near a recycling facility where there were no streetlights illuminating the darkness, no witnesses to observe their actions, nothing but the pitch-black emptiness of the Florida night, and fired additional shots into the car from the outside to make it appear as though unknown assailants had attacked them in a random act of violence.
The car is traveling westbound on Memorial Parkway, then goes north on 172nd and shows up at the hospital. The drive-by is completely and utterly false. How can I tell you that, ladies? Well, the detectives from Miramar at this point shut down the entire length of Miramar Parkway from 160th to 172nd. And they sit and they walk side by side for an hour, that mile-long stretch, looking for evidence of this drive.
When Bortland finally showed up at Memorial Miramar Hospital at precisely 4:35 a.m. that morning, he told police officers a harrowing story about a random drive-by shooting that had targeted their vehicle without warning or provocation. But the seasoned investigators on the scene weren't buying his account for even a single moment. They searched the entire stretch of Miramar Parkway where this alleged drive-by supposedly occurred. Walking methodically side by side for over an hour, combing every inch of that mile-long stretch of road, they found absolutely nothing. No shell casings scattered on the pavement. No glass fragments from shattered windows, no projectiles embedded in nearby structures, no tire marks from a fleeing vehicle.
A lack of any evidence whatsoever to support that a drive-by happened on Miramar Parkway. What would they look for? Shell casings, glass fragments, projectiles, tire marks. You're going to hear that there is none of that found whatsoever.
And when investigators finally obtained surveillance footage from the recording studio the group had left that night, they discovered something that completely and utterly contradicted the drive-by narrative Bortland had presented. There weren't just 2 people in that Jeep when it left the studio. There were 4. And Jamal Demons was clearly visible sitting in the rear driver's side seat. Now, let's talk about what the forensic evidence allegedly revealed when medical examiners conducted their detailed analysis. The medical examiners determined that the fatal wounds to both victims came from inside the vehicle, originating from the rear driver's side passenger seat, traveling outward toward the passenger side where the victims were seated. Even more disturbing and damning, they found evidence of stippling on one of the victims. Unburnt gunpowder residue that only appears when a firearm is discharged at extremely close range, typically within just a few feet.
The medical examiner's office is going to tell you is that when the drive-by was staged at 4:02 a.m., the victims were already dead. The medical examiner will be able to testify and tell you that the fatal shot to Anthony Williams, to his head, that enters in the back of his head and exits at the top, blowing out the front passenger window, was fatal. And that the additional wounds that are consistent with the trajectories going through the vehicle, these are.
The prosecution also presented what they claimed was essentially a confession to the crime. In the hours immediately following the shooting, someone reached out to Melly on Instagram asking if he was okay after hearing about the violent incident that had occurred. According to prosecutors, Melly responded with 3 chilling, incriminating words. "I did that."
This is where context matters. What does that mean? If you work at Google and you say, "My whole floor is coding," that's a good thing. If you work at Broward General Hospital and you say, "My whole floor is coding," that is a bad thing. The context around the message.
But here's where the case becomes infinitely more complicated and far less straightforward than the prosecution would have you believe. Despite all of this seemingly damning evidence, despite the forensics, despite the cell phone tracking data, despite the alleged confession, Melly's first trial in 2023 ended in a hung jury with reports suggesting the split was 93 in favor of acquittal on the top charges. Think about that remarkable fact for a moment. The prosecution presented their entire case to that jury, laid out all the cell phone tracking data, all the forensic evidence, the alleged confession, and still a significant majority of those jurors weren't convinced of guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. And so Melly remains trapped in a legal limbo that has stretched on for years upon years. As of now, he has been incarcerated for over 2,400 days, that's nearly 7 years, without a single conviction. His retrial, which was supposed to happen in September 2025, has been pushed back to January 2027 amid ongoing appeals over evidence admissibility.
Dimmons has been waiting in custody to see a trial on this case since, I believe, 2019. He obviously went to trial before that ended in a mistrial, and he's remained in custody since that. And he has a right to a speedy trial, a constitutional right to a speedy trial.
And just when it seemed like this already dramatic case couldn't possibly get any more dramatic or complicated, everything changed in September 2025 with a decision that shocked absolutely everyone. The plea deal that shocked everyone. September 9th, 2025 marked that date in your memory. The day before YNW Bortland was scheduled to begin jury selection for his own murder trial. A trial that would determine whether he would spend the rest of his natural life behind bars. He walked into that Broward County courtroom and did something that sent absolute shock waves through the hip-hop community and the legal world alike. He took a deal.
If you wake up tomorrow or the next day and you decide you've changed your mind and you want to resolve this case, both cases, by way of a jury trial, that's not going to happen. If you want to have a trial, the trial starts tomorrow. If you want to accept the deal, you can accept the deal today. But there's not going to be any buyer's remorse.
Now, let me put this stunning development into proper perspective for you so you can fully understand the magnitude of what occurred before this plea deal was offered and accepted. Cortland Henry was staring down the barrel of multiple consecutive life sentences. We're talking life in Florida State Prison, followed by life, followed by life, followed by life, followed by another 75 years. On top of all that, the man was looking at spending literally every remaining day of his existence behind bars if that jury convicted him. But with the stroke of a pen and a few words spoken in that courtroom, all of that terrifying future changed completely. The murder charges, both counts of first-degree murder with a firearm, were dropped entirely, dismissed, gone forever. In exchange for giving up his right to trial, Bortland pleaded no contest to 2 counts of accessory after the fact to murder and 1 count of witness tampering. His sentence, 10 years in prison, followed by 6 years of supervised probation with credit for all the time he'd already served behind bars. Given that he'd been locked up for approximately 4.5 years already, he could potentially be looking at release sometime around 2032, a far cry from dying in prison.
Mr. Henry, I'm not quite sure how your lawyers managed to do this, but I wish you good luck.
Even the judge presiding over the case seemed genuinely surprised and perhaps somewhat impressed by the outcome of these negotiations. Those words he spoke directly to Bortland after accepting the plea tell you absolutely everything you need to know about how unusual and unexpected this particular deal truly was. But here's where things get really interesting and really controversial in the court of public opinion. Part of this plea agreement includes something called a proffer. This is essentially a formal interview session where Bortland must sit down with prosecutors and provide them with a sworn statement about what actually happened that night in October 2018. Now, the immediate burning question on absolutely everyone's mind was painfully obvious. Is Bortland going to snitch on Melly? Is he going to provide testimony that could seal his former friend's fate?
This proffer agreement, of course, the prosecution wants him to cooperate, but there's no negative sanction for him if he does not. There's not a positive that he will receive if he provides certain information, and there's not a negative that he would receive if he doesn't cooperate or if he doesn't give any additional information. I think considering the possible lifestyle that he lives, and of course we're in a no snitching environment with certain demographics, that he probably will not say much of anything at all.
Bortland's attorneys have been absolutely emphatic and crystal clear about this particular point in all their public statements. They've stated publicly that there is no requirement or expectation whatsoever that he cooperate with the prosecution against his co-defendant Melly. The proffer, according to his legal team, will essentially amount to answering just a couple of basic questions about his own limited role in the events. Nothing more substantial than that.
There was a whole list of everything that would happen with the plea. What charges would get dropped, what he would get credit for, what would be a null process, which is just, it's getting taken away. Nothing in it said anything about cooperating. It was just him admitting to what he did, and he would get the 16 years, and that'd be it.
But not everyone in the public sphere is convinced by these assurances. The hip-hop community immediately erupted with heated debate and passionate arguments on both sides. Some observers labeled Bortland a snitch before he'd even sat down for the proper interview. Others argued more reasonably that taking a plea deal to save yourself from spending the rest of your life in prison doesn't automatically make you a rat or a traitor. Especially if the plea agreement explicitly doesn't require any testimony against your co-defendant.
Speaking of trials, YNW Bortland, he just took the plea for 10 years.
Good.
6 years probation.
Could they offer him 5 life sentences?
Yeah.
He been in there 5 years.
He's been in there 4.5.
And they know they done it.
But it's not a lot of evidence.
One perspective that cuts particularly deep came from a more controversial and outspoken voice who saw the plea deal as clear evidence of guilt rather than simply a strategic legal move to avoid risk. The prosecution, for their part, has framed the reasoning behind the plea deal quite differently. They cited insufficient evidence to prove that Bortland was actually a principal actor in the actual shootings themselves, essentially acknowledging publicly that while they could prove beyond a reasonable doubt that he was involved in staging the cover-up afterward, they couldn't prove beyond a reasonable doubt that he pulled the trigger or was directly responsible for causing the deaths of those 2 young men.
It's a total sweetheart deal. He was looking at multiple life sentences on the back end and essentially spending the rest of his life in prison. With this plea agreement, the plea, he pled no contest, I believe, to 2 counts, and the sentence promises 10 years.
But what about the intriguing theory that Bortland and Melly might have actually communicated with each other before the plea was officially accepted? Some legal analysts and court observers have suggested it's entirely possible, even likely, that the 2 defendants discussed this momentous decision beforehand.
Conversations between co-defendants, particularly people who are friends and people who have engaged or alleged to have engaged in certain conduct together, that's like, you're not going to snitch on me, I'm not going to snitch on you. At the end of the day, if that were to be the case, there's mutually assured